Shroud of Turin.
Yeah.
And I always thought that was fake.
And they found that it was like 2,000 plus years old.
Scientists have no idea how they faked it. It's got to be real.
In a locked vault in northern Italy lies a strip of linen that refuses to behave like fabric. It behaves like a photograph, 14 feet long, burned, folded, scarred by fire, and on its surface, the faint front and back imprint of a crucified man. No paint, no brushstrokes, no visible pigment, just an image resting on the outermost fibers, thinner than a human hair. For decades, the verdict seemed final. In 1988, 3 separate laboratories tested a fragment of the cloth. The result placed it squarely in the Middle Ages. Case closed. Medieval artifact. Mystery solved. Except it wasn't. Because the sample they dated came from a single corner. A corner that had been handled, repaired, and possibly rewoven centuries after the rest of the cloth. If that corner wasn't original, then what exactly was tested? And if the dating was flawed, what else about this artifact has been misunderstood? The deeper researchers looked, the less stable the conclusion became, and what they began uncovering inside the fibers would complicate the story far beyond a simple medieval forgery. For much of the 20th century, the narrative around the Shroud of Turin seemed straightforward. In 1988, 3 independent laboratories conducted radiocarbon dating on a small sample taken from the shroud. The results suggested the cloth dated to somewhere between 1260 and 1390 AD, placing it firmly in the medieval period. This finding was widely celebrated as definitive proof that the shroud was a medieval creation, likely a forgery or artistic rendering. The scientific consensus seemed settled. For decades, this conclusion stood as the authoritative answer to the shroud's age. But science does not always move in straight lines. New questions emerged. Researchers began examining the 1988 study with fresh eyes, asking whether the methodology had been as sound as initially believed. Questions arose about where exactly the sample had been taken and whether proper archaeological protocols had been followed. The sample came from a corner of the shroud that had been heavily handled and damaged over the centuries. This corner had been repaired using medieval techniques. Rather than replacing the damaged section with new cloth, the repair involved weaving new threads into the existing fabric. These threads were dyed to match the color of the aged linen. Binding agents were applied to help the new threads blend seamlessly with the original cloth. The sample tested in 1988 was not entirely original material. It contained a mixture of original linen fibers and medieval repair threads. It also contained accumulated grime, dust, and other contaminants from centuries of handling and exposure. This was a fundamental violation of basic archaeological protocol. When dating an artifact, the sample must be representative of the object being studied. It must be uncontaminated. It must be taken from a location that has not been compromised by restoration or repair work. The 1988 sample failed on all these counts. The laboratories had not dated the shroud itself. They had dated the patch. They had measured the age of medieval cotton and accumulated residue, not the original linen from the 1st century. The error was comparable to determining the age of an ancient statue by analyzing chewing gum stuck to its base. Recognizing this flaw, researchers began searching for alternative methods that could bypass contamination entirely. They needed a technique that could measure the age of the original linen without being affected by medieval repairs or accumulated dirt. In 2022, Italian physicist Liberato Daro from the Institute of Crystallography in Bari developed such a method. The technique is called wide-angle X-ray scattering, or WAXS. This method represents a fundamentally different approach to dating textiles. Rather than measuring radioactive decay, WAX examines the aging of linen itself at the atomic level. Specifically, it measures the degradation of cellulose, the primary component of linen fibers. Over time, linen undergoes natural chemical changes. The long polymer chains of cellulose gradually break apart. The crystalline structure of the cellulose degrades due to constant exposure to background radiation, humidity, and temperature fluctuations. This degradation process acts as an internal clock, recording the passage of time at the molecular level. To establish a reliable dating method, Daro and his team compared samples from the shroud with linen fabrics of known age. These comparison samples ranged from linen, used to wrap Egyptian mummies dating back to 3000 BC, to medieval textiles, from the 10th through the 14th centuries. By measuring the cellulose degradation in these samples of known age, the researchers could establish a baseline. They could create an aging curve that showed how much cellulose degradation occurs over specific time periods. Once this baseline was established, they applied the same analysis to the shroud samples. The results were unexpected by many observers. The aging pattern of the shroud's cellulose did not align with medieval textiles. The shroud showed significantly more degradation than would be expected for a cloth dating to the medieval period. In fact, the molecular structure of the shroud's linen matched almost perfectly with linen fragments recovered from the fortress of Masada in Israel. Masada fell in 74 AD, and the textiles found there are dated to between 50 and 74 AD, placing them squarely in the 1st century. This finding suggested that the shroud's linen dated to approximately the same period as the Masada textiles. If accurate, this would place the shroud's origin in the 1st century, during the time of Christ. The implications were profound. The 1988 radiocarbon dating had suggested a medieval origin. The 2022 WAXS analysis suggested a 1st century origin. These conclusions were fundamentally incompatible. One method or the other had to be wrong, or both had to be incomplete in their interpretation. It's important to note that the WAXS method is not without its own limitations and critics. Some researchers have questioned whether the technique is sufficiently refined to provide definitive dating results. Others have raised concerns about whether the comparison samples used to establish the aging curve were truly representative of the shroud's linen. The scientific community has not reached consensus on the validity of Darrow's findings. The debate continues. What we can say is that the 2022 WAX analysis presents a serious challenge to the 1988 radiocarbon conclusion. It suggests that the radiocarbon dating may have been compromised by the contamination issues that researchers had identified. Beyond the question of the shroud's age lies the equally perplexing question of how the image itself was formed. The image on the shroud is not a painting in any conventional sense. There are no brush strokes. There is no pigment. There is no ink. The image appears to be a chemical transformation of the linen fibers themselves. It sits on the surface of the cloth, extending only about 200 nanometers deep, which is hundreds of times thinner than a human hair. If you were to scrape the surface of the cloth, the image would vanish. It is not paint layered on top of the linen. It is a chemical change within the linen fibers themselves. The discoloration appears to be the result of oxidation and dehydration of the cellulose fibers. In other words, the fibers have been chemically altered, losing water and becoming oxidized. This type of chemical change can be caused by exposure to heat or radiation. But what source of heat or radiation could have created such a precise, detailed image across the entire surface of the cloth? Researchers have attempted to replicate the image using various methods. They have tried heat, they have tried acid, they have tried gamma radiation. None of these methods produced results that matched the characteristics of the actual image on the shroud. However, one method did produce a similar effect. Short, intense pulses of vacuum ultraviolet radiation could replicate the image characteristics. Vacuum ultraviolet radiation is a form of electromagnetic radiation with a very short wavelength. It is highly energetic and can cause the type of oxidation and dehydration observed on the shroud. But here's the problem. Vacuum ultraviolet lasers are a modern technology. They did not exist in antiquity. To create an image across the entire surface of the shroud using such radiation would require an extraordinarily intense pulse of energy, lasting less than a billionth of a second. Such a pulse would need to be powerful enough to imprint the cloth, but not so powerful as to destroy it. The energy requirements are difficult to imagine, and there is no known mechanism by which such energy could have been generated in the ancient world. If you value careful investigations into historical mysteries and scientific puzzles, consider subscribing to our channel. We explore topics at the intersection of history, science, and the unexplained. In 1976, researchers using NASA technology conducted a three-dimensional analysis of the image. They discovered that the shroud contains what appears to be a perfect three-dimensional representation of a human body. The intensity of the image at each point on the cloth corresponds precisely to the distance between the body and the cloth. In other words, the image is not flat. It contains depth information. This is a characteristic that would be extremely difficult to create intentionally, whether by painting, burning, or any other method known to medieval artisans. Digital analysis of the shroud has revealed what some researchers interpret as images of coins placed on the eyes of the figure. These coins appear to match rare coins minted by Pontius Pilate in 29 AD. If this interpretation is correct, it would suggest that whoever created the shroud had knowledge of extremely rare numismatic details. The probability that a medieval forger would have possessed such specialized knowledge and incorporated it into the image seems vanishingly small. The shroud also contains dust particles that have been analyzed and found to be consistent with dust from Jerusalem. Pollen analysis has identified pollen from plants that bloom only in the Jerusalem region and only during spring. This suggests that the cloth spent time in Jerusalem during spring. Blood analysis has revealed biochemical markers consistent with extreme physical trauma, including the type of trauma associated with crucifixion. The anatomical details of the image are remarkably precise. The nails appear to pierce the wrists rather than the palms, which is consistent with modern understanding of crucifixion practices. Medieval artists typically depicted crucifixion with nails through the palms. Following traditional artistic convention, the anatomical accuracy suggests that whoever created the image had detailed knowledge of crucifixion practices that was not widely known in the medieval period. The evidence surrounding the shroud is complex and multifaceted. We have the historical record, which is incomplete and contested. We have the radiocarbon dating from 1988, which suggested a medieval origin, but which has been criticized for methodological flaws. We have the more recent wax analysis, which suggested a first-century origin, but which remains controversial and not universally accepted by the scientific community. We have the image itself, which displays characteristics that are difficult to explain using conventional methods. We have the anatomical details, the pollen evidence, the dust analysis, and the blood analysis. Each piece of evidence tells part of a story, but the complete story remains unclear. It is important to distinguish between what we know with confidence and what remains speculative. We know that the shroud exists. We know that it bears an image of a human figure, showing signs of trauma. We know that various analyses have been conducted on the cloth. We know that these analyses have produced results that are sometimes contradictory. What we do not know with certainty is the age of the cloth, the method by which the image was created, or the identity of the person depicted in the image. The scientific community remains divided on these questions. Some researchers are convinced that the shroud is a medieval artifact, a clever forgery or artistic creation, whose methods we may never fully understand. Other researchers find the evidence for a first-century origin compelling. Still others remain genuinely uncertain, acknowledging that the evidence is ambiguous and that definitive conclusions may not be possible with current technology. What we can say with confidence is that the shroud is not a simple matter. It is not easily dismissed as a medieval hoax, nor is it easily accepted as definitive evidence of anything. The evidence is complex, sometimes contradictory, and subject to multiple interpretations. The shroud challenges us to think carefully about how we evaluate evidence, how we distinguish between what we know and what we believe, and how we navigate the space between certainty and mystery. If you found this investigation compelling and want to explore more topics at the intersection of history, science, and the unexplained, please consider subscribing to our channel. We are committed to careful investigation and balanced analysis of topics that challenge our understanding. The 1988 radiocarbon dating was presented as definitive, but subsequent analysis has revealed significant limitations in that study. The 2022 wax analysis presents an alternative interpretation, but it too has been subject to criticism and has not achieved universal acceptance. This is how science actually works. Conclusions are provisional. New evidence emerges. Methods are refined. Earlier conclusions are reconsidered. The process is not always neat or final, but it is how our understanding advances. The image formation remains one of the most puzzling aspects of the shroud. The characteristics of the image do not match any conventional method of image creation known from the medieval period or earlier, yet the image exists. Something created it. Understanding what that something was remains an open question. The vacuum ultraviolet radiation hypothesis is intriguing, but it raises as many questions as it answers. How could such radiation have been generated? What was its source? These questions remain unanswered. The anatomical details of the image continue to intrigue researchers. The accuracy of the depiction, including details that would not be widely known in the medieval period, suggests either that the creator possessed specialized knowledge or that the image represents something other than an intentional artistic creation. This does not necessarily mean that the image is a miraculous imprint. It means that the image's origin is not fully explained by conventional theories of medieval forgery or artistic creation. The pollen and dust evidence suggests that the shroud spent time in Jerusalem, but this evidence does not indicate when the image was created. A cloth could have traveled to Jerusalem at any point in history. The presence of Jerusalem pollen and dust does not establish the age of the cloth or the image. It merely confirms that the shroud spent time in that region at some point. The blood analysis reveals biochemical markers of extreme trauma. This is consistent with the image depicting someone who underwent crucifixion or similar severe torture. But again, this does not establish when the image was created. A medieval artist could have incorporated accurate blood analysis into the image if they had access to blood from a severely traumatized individual. The presence of these markers is intriguing, but it does not definitively answer the question of the shroud's origin. The Shroud of Turin remains in its vault in the Cathedral of St. John the Baptist. It continues to be preserved and studied by researchers from various disciplines. It continues to fascinate and perplex those who encounter it. Whether future investigations will provide definitive answers, or whether the shroud will remain a mystery, is impossible to say. What is certain is that the shroud represents a genuine puzzle at the intersection of history, science, and human experience. It reminds us that careful investigation, open-minded inquiry, and honest acknowledgement of uncertainty are essential to understanding the world around us.